Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week in This Week in Enterprise Tech, week 62, episode 62.
62 episodes, and it
Yes,
feels like everything is changing and nothing has changed, right?
I know. Every single week, it kind of feels like that. On the one hand, AI is changing things faster than we could have ever imagined. More change happening in the average month nowadays than what's happening in the average year. Call it pre-COVID in the mid to late 2010s.
Yeah, and yet it's all sort of the same. I remember I was at a Gartner event, this was 2 years ago, and I was talking to the CIOs. I had like 30 CIOs there, and I said,
Mhm.
all right, let's go around. What are the biggest issues facing you? And they went around sort of, and I heard them all, and I said, so this is a little scary to me because these are pretty much the same things I would have said 25 years ago.
Yep.
Some things about IT just never quite change, and it's this interesting confluence of all of this. And we'll be covering some of that today. On a little side note, I happened to talk to Ken Gonzalez today on an unrelated topic, and he again expressed how much he enjoyed being on the show as my stand-in a couple of weeks ago, and so I told him we'll have to get him on as a guest. I know we've been kicking around different ideas, so
Yeah.
a little bit of love from Ken on that, but it was a crazy week. In fact, I don't know how this happened. I thought there was the tech calendar schedulers out there that made sure that no major conferences conflicted. And of course, that
Oh gosh.
failed miserably last week when we had both ServiceNow Knowledge and IBM Think happen in the exact same time. So, of course, we got the fun job of going through, it felt like hundreds of press releases. But interesting stuff. Where do you want to start with those? I mean, two big conferences.
Yeah, get both ServiceNow and IBM are powerhouse vendors. We talk about both of them a lot, but I feel like ServiceNow, we have to start there just because we talk about them so much and because they're doing so much from an interstitial perspective, dealing with workflows, and they're such a growth engine right now. So obviously last week, ServiceNow had Knowledge 25, where they are both on a collision course with Salesforce in terms of trying to do CRM and workflow automation and all sorts of company stuff. But also they have to still cover their selves on the AI and the IT side. So it led to an interesting set of announcements. I felt like there was a lot of attention brought onto how ServiceNow was going to transform CRM and change CRM and how your CRM sucks and how they have to come in and re-transform CRM yet again. But that's not actually the thing that got my attention first. What got my attention was more on what they're doing on the data fabric and data layer side and starting to establish themselves there. Whereas it traditionally, ServiceNow has sold itself as being above the fray on the data side and being in the workflow side. I think AI is forcing everybody to be a workflow vendor and an agent vendor and a data vendor. There's no getting away from these pieces.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I think, to a certain extent, the big winner here is Salesforce and that their strategy around acquiring MuleSoft and some of their other plays has been, I think, being validated by moves like this.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, we've talked about it. I think that there's no way to avoid, particularly if you're a major class player like a ServiceNow or a Salesforce, you pretty much have to own the data layer now, or at least attempt to make the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the data layer is so critical and so impactful that it's pretty hard to have a compelling AI story at that scale without addressing the data fabric as a branding kind of thing, but the data layer of some form. Now that said, I was reading through it, their Data.World acquisition notwithstanding, which I think is interesting in its own right. But I'm reading through their data fabric and data network descriptions, their workflow data and fabric, workflow data network, whatever. And what's interesting is it is not entirely clear how far they're really going. I mean, so if I compare and contrast this, and look at the Salesforce acquisition of MuleSoft. MuleSoft was an extremely well-established data integration layer, right? An iPaaS layer that clearly stood to sit there and interconnect all of your data feeds and make it all work. There are a lot of companies that have various forms of the data fabric terminology in their stories, and it's a great, very evocative term, and it means almost nothing in terms of pragmatically what am I getting for it. And I'm
Mhm.
left with that sort of scratching my head here, in that it sounds like it's a quasi integration layer. They're talking about leaving data in place as well as some ingestion components into ServiceNow, but the ingestion components aren't into, near as I can tell, into like a data lake. It's directly into the ServiceNow platform itself. And so I left here with one of these sort of weird feelings where my first blush at it, I'm reading, it's like, ah, yeah, okay, this makes total sense. And then as it sunk in, it's like, yeah, but is there, right? What does this really in practice mean to me? And I'll compare it a little bit more recently with we're going to talk about SAP not as kindly in a little while later, but with SAP's recent announcements on their data fabric, where they're partnering with key data platforms to power that, and I feel like that maybe is a better strategy here. So I'm curious your take. Obviously, you're a data guy. I mean, did you see this as a positive or a negative here, or
I
neutral
saw
maybe?
it as necessary, but I agree that in comparison to the SAP Data Cloud, which was their basically SAP Databricks, their partnership with data with this, the data titan now, startup turned unicorn turned titan. I thought that was a smart move because it's a combination of go to market and data capabilities. And ServiceNow seems to be thinking that they can take on a lot of the integration and governance and cataloging of data all on their own through this data network, which uh, is followed with a bunch of buzzwordy language like empowering businesses to ecosystems of powerful ecosystem of trusted data partnerships, all these words that sound lovely and really challenge the user to figure out what is happening here. But I think at the end of the day, this is going to be most concretely described as a set of integrations, a data catalog to handle the metadata and definitions of data that are coming into place, and then being able to support some governance and lineage going forward by being able to control more of that back end of the data. I feel is what is fundamentally going on here. I agree. It would be nice to have a little bit more of a concrete idea of what is actually happening rather than simply activating strong
Well,
ecosystems.
it is interesting though, right? Because they are listing Cloudera, they're listing Databricks, Snowflake, Teradata, all as partners in this, right? And so it's very clear they're trying to position this as much more as a core part of the data pipeline. But if I think in terms of, and maybe this is a reflection more on me than anything, but if I look at this from more of a traditional way, if I'm looking at how do I manage and orchestrate a data pipeline and all the different pieces and parts to that, I'm struggling to understand where they're sitting. Are they just the last mile connector into the ServiceNow ecosystem? Is that all this really is? Or is this really a standalone offering in some way that's going to be a central part to my data pipeline? And right now I'm thinking it's the former. Um, but to their credit, and this is the part where maybe this is me not thinking about it properly, is the one thing that I will say they have going for them, again, kind of looking at this comparison to MuleSoft versus the Databricks SAP thing, is that those were both sort of the traditional, largely ETL driven models of how I do data level integration within a traditional enterprise stack type environment.
Mm-hmm.
And in ServiceNow's defense, they're clearly focusing this fabric, their fabric as they call it, their workflow data fabric, on not only workflows, but more specifically agentic AI powered workflows. And it does sort of beg the question, does that change the approach? I mean, like in our case with Symphony AI, what we're focused on is like we largely believe that this is all an integration layer. It's about
Mm-hmm.
connecting to data at rest and data in place, and not needing to have this whole data construct. Um, so, if that's a similar context, which I presume it is, then maybe that makes more sense. And maybe, we're looking at it wrong if we're comparing it. I think it's just difficult because that's the world they live in, right? They're in the world of Salesforce and SAP and these big
Mhm.
giant companies who have full on data products. So I think it's, that was my big takeaway. It was not really clear what this intended to be, but what is clear is that data is a key part of it. And so to your point, it was necessary.
Yes, but I do think there's going to be this real question about how much the data integration layer has to be defined. So ServiceNow is obviously going for kind of the old school, strong definitions and integrations layer. What you described with Symphony is kind of a level up, thinking more about access to the data and worrying less about absolutely defining the integration at every single little step. And then there's approaches like Zama Zagnani with her data mesh approach. She has a startup called Next Data, where she's actually trying to fully decentralize data to the point where you can define ecosystems around any data source at any time, complete flexibility, which is not going to be a use case that everybody needs for every use case, but it shows that we are thinking less about starting to create technologies that are not simply about the traditional data integration layer that is fully defined, but we're starting to create more flexibility. And AI is helping with that because now we can figure out what is the use case that we're really trying to support, or what is the data source centric view that we are taking, or the user centric view that we are taking, and then build everything around that, the user, the role, the industry. And it's going to be interesting to see how these different data governance approaches build out over time. Obviously, Symphony's made a bet in a direction that is different from what ServiceNow's doing.
Yeah, well, I do think I mean, I think it's to your point. It's going to be a little bit evolved, and part of it's use case driven, right? In our case, we are not. If I think of these other approaches, it's because you're trying to deal with core operational data. That's not what we're doing, right? And so, at least on the enterprise IT side, so I think that's part of it. I do think the other thing that if I look at well, if we kind of pull out a little bit from knowledge, is that necessarily, as we've talked to previously, they are having to expand their footprint, right? They cannot hit their growth targets at their scale, strictly staying focused on ITSM, which is why, of course, we're seeing all of this. They rarely even talk about ITSM anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I did find it so a couple takeaways around that. However, the first is that it's much like many of their competitors, although I think to a certain extent for their size more so, they're getting extremely broad. It's getting very hard to define what business they're in across the spectrum. The CRM introduction is an example. I mean, I guess they're trying to focus on, they're calling themselves the business transformation company or maybe a workflow company.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like all over the place. It's hard to keep track of it. And so I think that is interesting. And I think that some of the other announcements, and we'll just skate through them a little bit. So point to that, right? So I picked up on they're introducing what they're calling the core business suite, which I'm not really sure. What is striking me a little bit is it sort of sounds like it's trying to do much of what MoveWorks is attempting to do, an AI agent based approach to providing employees with access to HR and some other related, interestingly, though not IT, it sounds like. So like everything um,
Mm-hmm.
but focused on like suppliers and systems. And so that was sort of interesting. And then they also introduced a partnership with UKG, which UKG, of course, is one of the major
Mm-hmm.
HRIS companies. And this one also focused on employee productivity, but sounds like mostly trying to not step on UKG's toes, and that UKG has their own AI agent for HR, and so trying to buddy that up, but also sort of running in conflict with the core business suite offering, although that's sort of more in the finance, but also touching on HR. So again, sort of there's a weird overlap. And then they also had this really weird announcement that was basically talking about how they're trying to realizing the promise of lights out IT operations. And so, near as I can tell, it wasn't a product per se, but it was a whole series of agents on their agentic platform, all focused on various components of ITSM, ITOM, ITAM, various elements, with the premise being that if you, I guess, throw them all into the pot and stir it around, that you now have an autonomous IT operation. And so it was just like I guess that was an ode to the traditional space, but it was like this sort of mishmashy feel. And I
Mhm.
don't know, maybe it felt better for 5 days, instead of trying to digest it all at once. But it was like it really felt like all over the place. But again, I think if I compare it to AWS or any of these other big giant companies that you just get bombed with announcements. So I don't know. It was just an interesting sort of like I'm not sure what they're doing right now.
Well, they have to be all things to all people. Their stock price demands that when they are trading at something like 100 times their current revenue, it's obvious that their current revenue is not what they're being judged on. Everybody is assuming that they're going to become 5 or 10 times bigger. And now Bill McDermott and company have to prove that this is the case. So you have to go after CRM. And I'm legitimately curious how that ends up going, because if I were an enterprise and managing my CRM, I would probably just stick with my Salesforce, come what may, because it is a standard and it has all the integrations in the ecosystem already. There's no real reason to shift from a functional perspective. Like, not that people love using Salesforce as a CRM, but people don't hate it and people know how to use it. So what's there to
But
think
it's
about?
it's the same thing. Reason why SAP and Oracle and any of these big giant companies stick around for a long time, because the cost, the pain and suffering of getting off the platform is so high, and it's very difficult to create a value prop of why another system is that much better to do it. And I do think it's really interesting to compare and contrast this to Salesforce. And Salesforce clearly also has a whole bunch of SKUs,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But I do feel like I can much more succinctly articulate Salesforce's product suite and strategy than I can ServiceNow's at this point,
Mm-hmm.
which is an interesting turn of events, I feel, because it's like, but right now Salesforce is like you can disagree with the strategy, but it's pretty clear. It's like they've got their core data solution, they've got CRM, they've got service, they've got their collaboration platform, they've got their analytics platform in terms of Tableau. It all sort of hangs together. It all sort of, and now they get Agentforce that sits on top of it and sort of activates the whole thing. It's a pretty concise little package. And I feel like I can't do that with ServiceNow. And I feel like
Mm-hmm.
every time they do one of these, I'm adding more pieces to the puzzle. And so I think, because it seems very clear to me that you're seeing this sort of war shape up with others, but really between ServiceNow and Salesforce, at that large enterprise play. Um, I do think it's interesting, and so I think it's going to be really fascinating to see how the CRM part plays out, and if they can make an honest go at it, given that they have so many other irons in the fire. But it was interesting.
Yeah, ServiceNow definitely has an opportunity to take on the enterprise applications. And I'm interested in seeing how that push against the status quo goes, because Workday, to some extent, has made some progress in that field, talking about their ERP capabilities and building on top of HR, doing some finance, which is going so, but it hasn't disappeared. So Workday has shown that you can push your way into ERP from other places, and now it's ServiceNow's turn to see if they can do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be interesting. It will be very interesting to see. I think Salesforce has a vulnerability with CRM.
Mhm.
They focused on everything but CRM over the last 5 6 years. I won't say it's stagnated, but I think it is definitely sort of plateaued for them. And so there is potentially an opportunity there, but to your point, I'm not, unlike I think in the days of when Salesforce first rose, in the days of Siebel and others, where there was a lot of pain and suffering, there was a pent up demand for another option. I'm not sure I'm feeling that. I mean, there are lots of options right now in the CRM space. There's Zoho, there's Figure CRM, there's plenty of other. There's HubSpot, which has effectively
Mhm.
disrupted it, right? So I think right now there's plenty of other competitive options, and I don't know that I have not heard ServiceNow's pitch feel all that compelling as to what makes them truly different in that space. So I guess we'll see. We'll see how it plays out. I think it's going to be a very interesting couple of years between them and others. And speaking of others, let's talk about IBM. So now
Yeah.
IBM was really interesting for me. I covered Think a number of years ago.
Hmm.
We've talked to them in the past, and we've talked about how I feel like they're turning the corner a little bit. What I found most interesting about this Think and these series of announcements that sort of came out is that on the one hand, they sound a lot like everything else. So interestingly enough, right, they announced a data solution, a data platform,
Yes.
watsonx.data. They announced a productivity platform that does employee productivity. I mean, it was like, wow, these sort of mirrored announcements here. Um, and so on the one hand, you could say, well, they're just sort of an also ran in these areas. They're a little bit late, and they're coming in with very similar solutions. And are they in fact any different? But I would probably argue that that's in balance probably the better outcome, because the challenge has been you had all these guys, all these big animals sort of fighting it out over here, and then IBM was sort of off to the side saying, oh well, here's these other things. And they
Hmm.
sort of weren't in the conversation. They were really focused on really core, in-depth, technical, underlying architecture type of stuff. And they still obviously have all those acquisitions around all of that, but they are now starting to, I think, add the layer on top, which which is where everyone is focusing right now, and that could be a very potentially powerful combination. So I looked at these announcements and sort of felt like, ah, well, welcome to the fight, welcome back to the fight, and I guess
Hmm.
we'll have to see if they can make good on it.
Yeah, IBM is another one of these call it boring tech companies that has been growing rapidly over the past year from a stock perspective. They've almost doubled over the past couple of years. So obviously, the stock market world likes what they're doing. And I would say that a lot of the announcements they made were not necessarily new in the market, but they demonstrated that IBM is still solving these problems for the global 2000 companies that have the biggest challenges. That's always IBM's thing. If you want the easiest go to market capability that you can start using tomorrow, that's not IBM. It's just not. But the idea that IBM has to look at open source models, support for Mistral, being able to help with data access, data orchestration, data integration associated with models, and then being able to help with some of the lineage and performance on the IT side. I think that shows how IBM is being pushed to support AI at the end of the day. All of these capabilities. So even if you might say, dinosaur Big Blue has its product lineage, product roadmap basically shaped by AI, that's a sign of just how pervasive AI is all over the tech world.
Well, and I do think it's interesting. So IBM, I would say largely, or maybe to a far greater degree, has the problem I just talked about with ServiceNow, and that they have been all over the place. They've had all these acquisitions. They haven't done, in my opinion, a great job of integrating them at least into a compelling integrated story about how all these different solutions solve their problems. And yet they have been pretty universally good acquisitions. There's another one that they recently announced, which is the acquisition of DataStax, which
Yes.
really has two major products. Of course, they have both very closely linked to agentic AI. So they of course have a vector database, and then they have the LangFlow, which is the commercialized version of LangChain, which is an AI agent studio. And these are huge pickups, right? Huge pickups in the world of
Mm-hmm.
agentic AI. I increasingly look at IBM as sort of a building block company. They have all these underlying components, to your point, for the biggest companies in the world that need all of this, and they need them industrial grade, they need them supportable, all of that sort of stuff. And I think IBM has sort of been quietly building all of that. The question will be is if they can pull this together into a story that is relatable, that people can understand. Because I think, and this is the same challenge I think for ServiceNow, is that it's really, when you have this much breadth, it's just hard to get your head around it. It's just, it's hard to focus on, well, what the heck are you selling, and how can this actually add value to me, and how do all the pieces fit together? But I think the position, I think in general, I like this messaging and this positioning better than what they've been doing in the past as far as bringing it together. Minus the Watson X thing, I just wish they would have just let Watson die a nice easy death a few years back. But whatever, that aside, I think it's much better.
Yeah, I have a soft spot in my heart for Watson. I feel like that was a big bet IBM took, and although it didn't work, I think it at least showed them trying to do something that was different. And they obviously learned from marketing AI the first time. They have, for better or for worse, they have been through all of the challenges that exist already in messaging AI. So this is the second time around. It might have been an expensive lesson to learn, but they definitely seem to have learned it in terms of how to not overpromise this time around, and to basically provide stepwise announcements as they happen. But I agree that the challenges, I'm not sure that it has all consolidated into a cohesive package of capabilities. And this is an issue that IBM has had in the past. I think back to the analytics days where IBM had Cognos and they had SPSS. They had all, and of course, they had their database capabilities, and it never quite all came together into that data and analytics package. And now they have now IBM has kind of a similar problem where they have the API agents, they have models, they have their visibility capabilities, they have DevOps capabilities, they have Red Hat. They have all these pieces of the puzzle that are associated with AI deployment. And can it come together into a story that the market buys as IBM being an enterprise AI vendor? Or will it just be a bunch of little pieces that never quite come together into the multi-million-dollar package that IBM wants?
Yeah, it's going to be the big question. I think they have a massive opportunity because of their footprint, because of the organizations that they're the companies that they've purchased, and therefore the various platforms that they have. They have so many touch points into the enterprise. If they can figure that out, and I feel like they're getting closer. I think we're going to be talking, 6-12 months from now, about how IBM has sort of stepped it up. I have this sense that they are going to really kind of figure it out. And again, if I compare and contrast, and I don't know why we're picking on SAP today, but if I compare and contrast to SAP and some of their moves, they've made some decent moves recently, but in general, I think SAP is just sort of like Oracle. I feel like these two companies are just sort of, they're trying to do a little bits around the edges, but for the most part, all their money is in their bread and butter business that is just sort of there. It's too expensive to undo, at least for now. And so they're just sort of treading water. Whereas I look at IBM and I feel like they've been much more aggressive in acquisitions, in smart acquisitions. They're all part of the future and where this is going. So I have a feeling we're going to be talking a lot more about IBM's as a player in all of this as this goes on.
Yeah, HashiCorp and DataStax, Apptio, Turbonomic, a lot of nice pieces for market leaders that give a lot of visibility to IT. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and I think for good reason, our last IBM story here is that they also released a study, and I don't know if it's surprising, but it's good to see the data that basically CEOs, and I appreciate that this was a CEO-based study versus CIOs. CEOs are basically doubling down. They're just continuing investing. And there's another report, this one from AWS, effectively saying the same thing. And this one is basically talking about how generative AI and AI investments are now overtaking security as the top budget spend for tech or for enterprises. You look at both these studies together, and what you see is that AI is in this really bizarre sort of state. And I don't know if we've ever really seen this, because we are seeing a massive amount of investment, despite the fact that almost every organization, I think, is still struggling to truly bring this to production at scale, to truly generate the ROI, to truly demonstrate the value. And yet everyone can see so much promise that the investments are continuing, the strategic importance is continuing. And so I think it validates why everybody is so hot and heavy on figuring out how to be a player in the space, because it is very clear that this is where the money is going to go, and it's also very clear by both of these studies, if you sort of read into the details of it, that there's more unknowns than knowns. There's still so much opportunity for someone to really get it right, and this is validated by almost every single CIO I talk to. Well, I'm now running into companies that have a chief AI officer or a head of their AI projects or whatever that is happening. Very, very few companies I'm talking to have any significant footprint in production, any significant, and so it is very clear that we are still so early in this process, and yet there's all this investment. So it's, I think it's going to be this really interesting dynamic that I don't think we've seen anything like this.
Yeah, I think two data points that really stuck out to me on the IBM study. One I agree with, one I disagree with. The one I disagree with is that surveyed CEOs said about a third of the workforce will require retraining over the next 3 years. I think practically everyone will need retraining over the next 3 years, because we're coming to a point where AI is going to do 20 to 30% of our work if you're a knowledge worker, like across the board. Just deal with it. Like if there's some commoditized task that you're dealing with that you are probably never going to do again in about 5 years' time. And I think anybody who thinks that 2/3 of their workforce don't need training on AI, I think that is completely off. But the
Maybe
other,
it's because they're planning on getting rid of the other 2/3. I don't know.
yeah, which I don't think is going to happen either. If you're expecting AI to be a huge workforce reducer, I think that's a huge mistake as well. Completely missing the point of what this actually does. But the other point that I thought was interesting was 72% of CEOs thinking that proprietary data was a key to making AI work. And as we all know, that means you cannot use out of the box models at all for what you're trying to do at the end of the day. You've got to have multiple layers of governance to make sure that your proprietary data stays safe.
Yeah. Speaking of which, we sort of glossed over the Data.World acquisition by ServiceNow. I do think it's important because it addresses that. So I'm sort of up in the air on the whole data pipeline piece. But the data governance and data lineage, I think, is a critical part, and that was this acquisition. I think is the interesting aspect of this that I don't know is being addressed well. I think and it's a massive challenge. Now, going all the way back to where we started, it only is really relevant when you're talking about these proprietary data, and I'm focused on the ability to ensure veracity, right? If I'm dealing with ITSM data, frankly, even CRM data, probably doesn't matter that much, right? I mean, there's a degree of relevance, but not nearly the same as when I'm talking about this proprietary data that is linked to my business workflows that are driving competitive advantage. You've got to get that nailed down. And I do think, I'm encouraged by the fact that I do think maybe I don't know what it is about this technology. So much of the technology through the past, there's always this massive divide that the enterprise leadership, non-CIO enterprise leadership, can never quite get their head around the technology and how it worked and the value it could bring. And maybe this is why we're seeing this shift in the budgets, right? Maybe because of OpenAI and because they were able to actually see it and they could, get their hands on it and play with it and see the value. But it's like the imagination gap has closed or is closing dramatically. And so CEOs, I think, have a much better handle on how this technology can be transformative than they have with other types of technology in the past. And so I think that is that's interesting and encouraging, and I think it's going to be reflected in how organizations approach it. It's also, however, going to make it harder, because the issue I think that we see is that the data estate within many organizations is in pretty bad shape, at least if I'm going to start putting an AI layer on top of it, where I don't have a human that can go, no, that data is not right. Right. And that's one thing that AI is not really good at right now, is having any form of discrimination on that data, saying, oh, that doesn't line up right. Right. It just takes it. It's like, oh, you were doing 10% every month, and this month it was 80%. Hey, good for you. It's like, there's no questioning of it. So I think that part is going to be interesting. But yeah, it was. I think it was an interesting point of data, and I actually found it encouraging.
Yeah, and I'm of two minds about that. I feel like, yes, it is important to protect proprietary data, but I think that the data quality issue might be a little bit overblown simply because I live in the real world. And in the real world, I just don't think we're ever going to get past better than like 70% data quality in the enterprise, no matter what we do.
I don't disagree. I think the challenge or question is, and this is, I guess, what I was alluding to, is that we have a sort of natural ability to spot data that's off, right? I mean, I come from the ITSM world, right? And ITSM has been notoriously bad for human generated content that was just, the click, 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 or they put in googly goblin. It's like you would see that and you immediately go, okay, that's what this was. AI doesn't do that, right? And
Right.
AI just takes it at face value. And so that's a challenge. And so to the extent that we can't get data better, it's going to make it difficult, particularly for these higher risk use cases. And so I think, we may, in the end of all this, come, we talked about this. It's been a while since we talked about it, but we talked about that maybe all this Gen AI stuff wasn't the end all. This was a step, and there's going to be something better.
Mm-hmm.
And if it is, if the thing that may eventually be its undermining is this, right? If we can't get the data accurate enough, just because of the nature of enterprise AI or enterprise IT and enterprise organizations, and the AI isn't smart enough to somehow manage for that, to manage the fact that it's only 70 or 80%, then do we have a way to manage that? Is there a way through that? And that could be the thing that ultimately, is the thing that causes the problem. But we'll see. Anyway, we need to move on. Along we're going to do sort of a quick hit here on three. We try to always wrap up with what's important to CIO. We didn't have a big juicy CIO story, but three. I'll kind of cue them up for you here, and then you can go through them. But three sort of quick hit stories. The first, I think this is relevant from a CIO perspective. There's a interesting and simmering battle between Microsoft and OpenAI. Effectively, I think the easiest way to characterize this is Microsoft is trying to renegotiate their contract with OpenAI, leveraging on the fact that OpenAI is trying to change their structuring model so that they're turning into a core profit, which they've now officially abandoned in large part because of this negotiation with Microsoft. The Microsoft had effectively blocked it. And I'm not sure if there's an impact to an enterprise buyer, but I think if you're in bed with either of these companies, which you probably are, you need to at least be paying attention to. So that was one. The second one was there is a article from CompTIA saying that probably no shock to any CIO out there that the tech market is sort of in a bit of a tumult period where lots of not layoffs, but job shrinkage and not letting attrition kind of play out. And then the last one, of course, we'll say the last one. The last one's a government thing, I guess. So what's your take on these two, and how, from a CIO's perspective, what would you make of them?
Yeah, I think the biggest interesting thing about Microsoft versus OpenAI is that anybody who made their AI decision, call it 18 months ago, probably thought that Microsoft and OpenAI were joined at the hip, and that the development of Microsoft AI was dependent on the progress that OpenAI was making. We're actually starting to see both companies hedge their bets to some extent. OpenAI is obviously working a lot more with SoftBank nowadays, and Microsoft is working on its own models, and we're starting to see this delinking. And this may mean that over time, that if you are betting on the OpenAI stack, you may not be necessarily be able to get all of that directly through Microsoft, and you may have to set up a separate relationship with OpenAI and vice versa. This is not as coupled a relationship as it previously was. And I think from a strategic perspective, that is probably the most important thing to keep in mind. I don't think that CIOs really care whether OpenAI is a nonprofit or for profit organization, other than that might change the profit model just a little bit and perhaps the pricing that OpenAI brings to market. But it seems like OpenAI is still already fairly expensive, quite frankly. So I don't think that's going to change much.
Yeah, well, I do think I think it's interesting. I think OpenAI has the greatest risk. I think they have a lot more to lose here. I mean, Microsoft has largely caught up, maybe not caught up, but they've made massive investments in developing very enterprise focused models. They, I think, are sort of unburdened by this desire to create AGI. That isn't their primary thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're not trying to do all this research from like an esoteric standpoint. Um, and I think at the same time, OpenAI is going through the growing pains, right? So part of the related news is OpenAI hired two new executives in part to help offload Sam Altman. And I think they're trying to figure out how to become a real company now, right? And that sounds weird because seeing as how big they are, but I think in large part they've been in this weird sort of flux state, carried effectively riding this big
Mm-hmm.
giant wave. In fairness, that they created, but just riding this wave. And so I think from the risk, at least from an enterprise perspective, if I'm them, it's like if I'm a CIO today and I have to pick, if I see a separation happening, I'm probably picking Microsoft
Mm-hmm.
because there's a whole lot more there. My investment platform with them is much larger, all of that. And so I think that potentially does not bode well for OpenAI over the long haul. But we'll see. I don't know that this isn't a done deal. I don't think there's any signs that there's anything imminent, but definitely worth watching. What was your take on the job side of it?
On the job side, I think that it's interesting to see how IT talent is shifting, and we are letting a lot of our old workers simply go without hiring new people. This probably reflects the challenges that entry level workers are seeing and not being able to find jobs in the IT space, that people just aren't hiring right now. People think that there is no need for additional capacity in managing IT. And probably that also reflects how the interesting tech jobs, such as data science, might not necessarily be a part of IT anymore, but have been moved over to line of business and cost of goods departments, where they are thinking of technical capabilities more directly as part of the business. And we're starting to see this bit of a shift from monolithic IT.
Yeah,
Mhm.
no, I do think it's interesting. Well, in part, they when these older workers retire, they can't replace them because they can't find anyone that knows COBOL. So
Mhm.
that's part of the problem. But the I do think it's interesting sort of period. I'm not convinced that this isn't driven in large part by the macroeconomic state that people are right now in a holding pattern with all of the
Yeah.
uncertainty with
Last
tariffs and
month
what
was
have
not
you.
a good month to hire anybody because nobody knew what the hell was going on.
Yeah, so I don't know if I want to read too much into all of this. I also think it's worth noting that ironically enough, um, all of this focus on AI and agentic AI, the greatest impact to jobs today might actually be on IT because there's so many
Mhm.
applications from coding to other things um, that IT was made for it, right? It was just like a perfect alignment with the power and capabilities of most of these AI tools. So I think that could also be weighing on it. But I guess we'll have to see if that trend continues or not. Because the reason I'm probably hedging a little on it is that I look at AI as in some ways a different beast, but in many ways just the latest version of a story we've seen happen over and over and over again, which is you deploy this new technology, it changes the way we work, it increases productivity, but all it really does, it's not about mass elimination or even really any significant change. It just changes how much we're able to get done with the number of people, and it just expands our output, not reduces our size. And so I think that as this plays out, given to the other story we just talked about, massive investments within the enterprise and all this, well, somebody has to put all that to work. So I think we're going to see a shift, but I'm not convinced that we're going to see a major shrinkage here.
Yeah, when we think of the classic Gartner hype cycle, probably the best diagram they've ever created. The AI as a function of replacing workers, we've got to be at the frothy top of that hype cycle right now. And we are about to find out just how AI is not actually replacing people. But right now, everybody thinks it's going to happen, I think, on the executive side. So they're not they're freezing hires for the moment. That plus macroeconomic challenges. So
Yeah.
um, yeah.
All right. Well, before we get to our last closing fun article or topic, we also try to squeeze in something around government, and you picked up one, and I'm really curious what you thought of this one. It was a DoD Department of Defense memo that you thought was noteworthy. Why?
Yeah. So the Department of Defense came out and flat out said our software procurement process is broken and we've got to fix it and modernize it and make it great again, I suppose. As if government procurement of software was ever great. So I guess they're going to go for it. And the interesting thing to me is that the acting CEO, CIO, not the actual CIO, but I think there's some weird phrase about performing the duties of the CIO. She actually has some technical cred. She came in as a CISO. She was a CISO in the first Trump administration as well. So at least she has several years of experience with managing government technology, which is a step up from, frankly, just about everything else I have seen so far on the technical side, say from what Doge and other so-called audits were supposed to be doing.
I mean, this is one of those where it's mom and apple pie. How do you disagree with it? How do you argue with it? Of course, it makes sense. I mean, here's the quote from it. This initiative will lead the department's adoption of best practices to obtain, develop, and field secure software. The SWIFT initiative will define clear and specific cybersecurity and SCRM requirements, rigorous software security verification process, secure information sharing mechanisms, and federal government-led risk determination to expedite the cybersecurity authorizations for rapid software adoption. Okay, yeah. Why wasn't that always the case? And B, what does that really mean? Right? What are they going to actually do? Because it's not, the high level, we need to do this isn't the hard part. It's the actual, how do you put this into practice and how do you solve for it? So I guess we'll see. I agree. It's hard to say, oh my gosh, why are they doing this? The
Yeah, the
question
hard
really
part
is
from a practical perspective, the hard part is that typically software has to be on a schedule. It has to be bundled into existing federal approved federal vendors and approved federal providers who are able to implement the software securely into wherever it needs to go. And then also the government needs to be able to track the security vulnerabilities associated with each software vendor that might be brought in, and that due diligence is going to be the tricky part. I sure hope they do it, for the sake of America.
well, the issue. I mean, is scale. I mean, this is the Department of Defense, right? Those four things are really
Yes.
simple to do if you're a small little organization with a few hundred employees. Try to do it across, however, I forgot what the DoD employs now, several hundred thousand. I mean, that's where suddenly this becomes a challenge. So, hey, wish them best of luck. We'll hope it works. All
Yes.
right, so we're going to close out as always with something a little bit light and funny, and this is maybe as much depressing as it is light and funny, but two interestingly sort of conflicting news stories, both related to SAP. We've alluded to it throughout the show about picking on SAP. I'll just cue them both up here. The first is a report, I guess. So SAP introduced something called the RISE service or the RISE with
Rise with
SAP program.
SAP. Yep.
And shockingly, customers are saying, yeah, it hasn't worked out all that well. And at the same time, SAP announced that they've just extended their contracts for Christian Klein, their CEO, and their CFO, Dominic Asam, by 2 years each. So doubling down on the executive team and yet still struggling to find real relevance. We've been talking recently about the S4HANA challenges, and it's like we find very little like positive talk about them, and yet I guess, their executives are nice and stable. So it's sort of funny,
Yeah,
I
it's
guess.
really interesting. So another rare thing, I'm going to say another thing, nice thing about Gartner. So Gartner analyst Alessandro Galimberti did this research looking at Rise with SAP customers and found that this program, which is designed to provide optimization and management and digital transformation for SAP customers, isn't going as planned. They're not meeting their SLAs. They're having challenges with the implementation. And the part that I find most interesting about this is that a lot the challenges that this Gartner analyst found were often related to the fact that Rise with SAP was sold to business executives, but then the techies and IT people had to actually work on the deployment and work on the transformation and work on the modernization and found out that the details hadn't quite been hammered out along the way, leaving them with a lot of extra work to do and leading to the inability to meet SLAs. And
And yet, the
yeah,
question is, does any of it actually matter? I mean, I remember I went to Sapphire. It's been a few years since I've been to Sapphire, but and anyway, like Bill McDermott was still there, right? And I remember at the time thinking how how conflicted it felt, because all I ever heard from executives was how much they hated SAP and how painful it was, and yada yada yada. And yet here was a super flashy show and obviously gobs of money,
mhm.
and it's like the juxtaposition between these two, and it just speaks to the fact that it's deeply ingrained software. It's deeply embedded into the organization of their clients, and which is most organizations, most enterprises have it. It's really hard to displace, and there's very little value in replacing it for the most part, and so you just sort of suffer through it. And I guess the question is, does it matter? Does it, in the age with all the other battles and fights, does, if you're a CIO, if you're an enterprise leader, does it matter? And maybe the right answer is no, it doesn't, and you should just stop complaining about it and move on. I don't know.
But it does seem like SAP is making real progress with their cloud migration velocity, which is something they've struggled with for years, which is why the executives got these extensions, because SAP said at the end of the day, we're looking at our numbers and we are hitting our numbers. The stock is up 50% over the past year. So there's no way you can complain about that. Like that, that's
Well, that's
amazing.
sort of what I mean. It's like well, when you have like this analysis of the rise of SAPU, and you just talk to executives, and you get all that sort of negativity, and we sort of give them a bad time all the time. But to your point, the numbers, if you look at it from a stock perspective, from a revenue perspective, from a profit perspective, if you take all the esoteric stuff away from a raw business standpoint, it's a good business, right? And that's
Mhm.
what I'm saying. So it's like one of these weird situations where it sort of doesn't matter, and it's like as a human, I sort of have trouble with that. It's like I have trouble processing. It's like, how does it not matter? But I guess it's just
Well, if you
it,
customize anything enough, it gets stuck in there. It's like a house. You could live in any old cave, but once you've, figured out what you want with your house, it's impossible to leave, right?
it's all
SAP
done, I
becomes your
guess.
house. Nice.
I think that's a pretty good analogy. It's like you
Uh-huh.
you built your custom house, and you can complain about it, but it's yours. You built it, so there you go.
You built it, it's yours. Welcome to SAP. Yes.
All right.
And on that note, thank you so much for joining us for another week of This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park here with Charlie Araujo. If you liked this, please like, subscribe, comment, let us know what you thought, and we'll be back next week.